There is a photograph taken in February of 1933 that almost no history textbook chooses to include. In it, some of the most powerful industrialists in Germany, men who controlled steel mills, chemical empires, coal mines, and banking dynasties, are seated in a room at the Reichstag, leaning forward with polite, expectant expressions on their faces. Standing before them, gripping the lectern with both hands, is a man who had once been a failed painter from Austria, a man who had eaten in soup kitchens, a man who had slept in homeless shelters and peddled postcards on street corners to survive, a man the German establishment had, for years, dismissed as a vulgar joke. That man was Adolf Hitler. And within hours of that meeting ending, those industrialists, household names behind some of the most celebrated corporations in the world, would write checks totaling 3 million Reichsmarks to fund the political machine that would, within months, dismantle German democracy forever. What you are about to hear is not the story of how a madman seized power. That version is too simple and frankly too convenient, because it absolves the people who made it possible. This is the story of a transaction, a calculated, coldly rational business deal struck between German capital and National Socialism, and the catastrophic consequences that neither party fully anticipated, or perhaps simply chose not to care about. If you've never heard this version of history before, stay with me, because what actually happened is darker, more deliberate, and more human than any single villain could account for. To understand what happened in 1933, you have to go back much further than most people are willing to go. You have to go back to a Germany that was humiliated, economically strangled, and psychologically broken. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919 at the end of the First World War, imposed on Germany conditions so punishing that even John Maynard Keynes, one of the architects of the modern Western economy, publicly condemned it as an act of financial barbarism. Germany was forced to accept sole responsibility for the war. It was stripped of territory, its military was gutted, and it was saddled with reparations equivalent to roughly 132 billion gold marks, a debt so staggering that Germany would not finish paying it off until 2010. Documents from the era indicate that the German political class across the entire spectrum, from moderate conservatives to democratic socialists, understood that the Versailles terms were unsustainable, but they differed violently on what to do about it. The Weimar Republic, Germany's first attempt at parliamentary democracy, lurched from crisis to crisis throughout the 1920s. Hyperinflation destroyed the savings of the middle class practically overnight. In 1923, a loaf of bread in Berlin cost more than 4 billion marks. People burned currency as firewood because it was cheaper than buying wood with it. This is the world that created the audience for Adolf Hitler. He was not, as many people assume, an overnight phenomenon. He had been cultivating a particular kind of fury for years, not just his own but Germany's. According to accounts from early party members and journalists who covered him in the 1920s, Hitler possessed an almost preternatural ability to absorb the grievances of a room and then project them back at a volume and intensity that left audiences feeling both understood and enraged. He did not manufacture resentment. He metabolized it. He gave it shape, gave it enemies, gave it future. What he lacked, for most of the 1920s, was money. And this is where the story becomes something that no biography of Hitler and no account of the Second World War can afford to treat as a footnote. The relationship between Hitler and German big business did not begin in 1933. It began much earlier, in the drawing rooms and private clubs of Munich and Berlin, where industrialists were already watching the political landscape with the particular anxiety of men who had a great deal to lose. The early 1920s had terrified the German business community in ways that went far beyond the economic chaos of inflation. The Russian Revolution of 1917 was barely 5 years old. Communist movements were gaining strength across Europe. In Bavaria in 1919, a short-lived Soviet republic had been declared before being violently suppressed. The specter of Bolshevism, of expropriation, of workers seizing factories, of the entire architecture of private property being torn down, haunted the dreams of every major German industrialist. And so, very early on, some of the most powerful men in German industry began looking at the fractious, violent, explicitly anti-Marxist movement coalescing around Adolf Hitler with something that, over time, would shade from cautious interest into active support. Fritz Thyssen was one of the first. the heir to one of Germany's most powerful steel dynasties. Tyson met Hitler in 1923 and was reportedly transfixed. According to his own memoir, written years later, after he had fled Germany and had the luxury of hindsight, Tyson described Hitler's early speeches as a revelation. He subsequently provided the Nazi Party with 100,000 gold marks at a time when the party was operating out of a beer hall and could barely afford printing costs for its pamphlets. That money kept the movement alive through some of its most precarious early years. Tyson was not alone. Records from the period, pieced together by historians including Adam Tooze and Henry Ashby Turner Jr., reveal a pattern of financial support flowing from German industry to the Nazi Party throughout the 1920s. Not always in large amounts, not always consistently, and not always with a clear ideological motivation. Some donors believed Hitler was a useful battering ram against the left, to be discarded once he'd served his purpose. Some were motivated by nationalism, by genuine sympathy with his message, or simply by the transactional logic that it never hurts to have friends in every political camp. If this story is already making you uncomfortable, that's exactly why it matters. Share this video, because the most dangerous parts of history are always the parts that feel too complicated to discuss. The Wall Street crash of 1929 changed everything. Almost overnight, the American financial system collapsed, and because the Weimar Republic had become deeply dependent on American loans to stabilize its economy and service its war debts, Germany was swept into a depression of catastrophic proportions. By 1932, unemployment in Germany had reached over 6 million people, roughly 30% of the workforce. Industrial production had collapsed. Banks were failing. The middle class, which had already been devastated once by the hyperinflation of the early 1920s, was being destroyed a second time. In this environment, the Nazi Party's electoral support exploded. In the 1928 federal elections, the NSDAP had received just 2.6% of the vote, a fringe movement, barely registering. By July of 1932, they were receiving 37.4%, the single largest share of any party in the Reichstag. This is the moment the German business establishment stopped treating Hitler as a peripheral figure and started treating him as a political reality they needed to manage. There are letters, actual letters, recovered from archives after the war, that reveal the calculations being made in the boardrooms of Germany's most powerful corporations during this period. Men like Albert Vogler of United Steel, Gustav Krupp of the Krupp Armaments dynasty, and various board members of IG Farben, the chemical conglomerate that would later become infamous for its role in the Holocaust, were all engaged in discussions about how to navigate the political crisis, and increasingly about what a Hitler government might mean for their industries. The critical meeting happened on February 20th, 1933. Hitler had been appointed Chancellor of Germany just 3 weeks earlier, on January 30th, through a backroom deal engineered by conservative politicians who believed, with almost incomprehensible arrogance, that they could control him. On the evening of February 20th, he was ushered into a room in the official residence of Hermann Göring, who at the time was president of the Reichstag. Waiting for him were approximately 25 of Germany's most powerful industrial and financial figures. The meeting had been arranged quietly, through networks of personal connection and mutual interest. What was said in that room has been partially reconstructed from notes and testimony given after the war, and the picture reveals is chilling in its ordinariness. Hitler spoke for approximately 90 minutes. He told them that German democracy was finished, that the upcoming elections would be the last for at least 10 years, possibly forever. He told them that he intended to destroy Marxism root and branch permanently. He told them that a strong, stable, authoritarian state was a necessary precondition for German economic recovery and international prestige. And then he left the room and let Göring and Jalmar Schacht, Hitler's economic advisor and future president of the Reichsbank, handle the practical details. The practical details were 3 million Reichsmarks to be distributed among the Nazi Party and its coalition allies for the final push before the March 5th elections. IG Farben contributed 400,000 marks. Deutsche Bank and Dresdner Bank contributed. The coal, steel, and chemical industries contributed. The money flowed in a matter of days. Before we go any further, leave a like on this video, because what comes next is the part that most documentaries gloss over entirely. the part about what those businessmen actually got in return. There is a persistent myth about the relationship between Hitler and German big business that survives to this day in popular imagination. The myth goes something like this. The industrialists funded Hitler. Hitler took power, and then Hitler turned on them, subordinating private enterprise to the will of the Nazi state, nationalizing industries, and proving himself ultimately to be just as hostile to capitalism as any communist would have been. This myth is comforting because it implies that the businessmen were naive, that they were fooled, that they paid a price for their miscalculation. It implies that evil eventually punishes those who enable it. It is, in the most important ways, false. The reality, documented in meticulous detail by economic historians who spent decades in German, American, and British archives, is considerably more disturbing. The German business community did not simply survive under National Socialism. With notable exceptions, they thrived. Rearmament, which Hitler began in earnest the moment he consolidated power, was an economic windfall for German heavy industry on a scale almost impossible to overstate. The armaments orders that flowed to Krupp, to Rheinmetall, to the aircraft manufacturers, to the shipyards. These were not small-scale government contracts. They represented a state-directed flood of investment into precisely the industries whose owners had been writing checks to the Nazi Party throughout the late 1920s and early 1930s. IG Farben, the chemical giant, became so deeply integrated into the Nazi war economy that it essentially became a state within a state. By the end of the war, it had constructed its own concentration camp, IG Auschwitz, where it used slave labor from the adjacent death camp to produce synthetic rubber and fuel. The company's executives were among the defendants at the Nuremberg trials. Several were convicted, several were not. Almost all of them returned to positions of influence in post-war German industry within a decade. Decades later, witnesses and historians would note a particular quality to the relationship between the Nazi state and German capital. It was not the relationship of a government and its subjects. It was not even the relationship of an employer and employees. It was closer, in some ways, to the relationship between two criminal enterprises that have recognized their mutual interest in a particular territory and decided to divide it between themselves. The Nazi state needed the industrial capacity, the organizational expertise, and the international credibility that only established corporations could provide. German industry needed the political order, the suppression of organized labor, the elimination of communist competition, and eventually the enormous captive markets and slave labor pools that Nazi conquest would make available. Each side had something the other desperately wanted. The arrangement was never a mystery to either party. Subscribe to this channel right now, because this story goes even deeper, and the next section contains information that has never made it into a mainstream documentary. What is almost never discussed is the psychological architecture of the men who enabled this. We have become accustomed to thinking about the Nazi leadership as ideologically possessed, as true believers in a death cult, and many of them were. But the industrialists, the bankers, the corporate lawyers who made themselves indispensable to regime, these were not, for the most part, ideological fanatics. They were pragmatists, and their pragmatism was, in its own way, just as lethal. Consider the case of Gustav Krupp von Bohlen und Halbach. Krupp had not been a supporter of Hitler in the early years. According to account from business associates at the time, he was deeply skeptical, dismissive, even of the Nazi movement's vulgarity, its street violence, its aesthetic crudeness. Krupp came from a world of aristocratic restraint, of generational wealth, of family names that were synonymous with German industrial power, going back to the 19th century. But Krupp was also watching, with clinical attention, what the new government was doing to the German economy and to his company's order books. Within months of Hitler's appointment as chancellor, the Krupp works were receiving armaments contracts on a scale they hadn't seen since the First World War. By 1934, Krupp had become one of the most enthusiastic supporters of the regime, publicly lavish in his praise of the Führer, and deeply integrated into the Nazi rearmament program. What had changed? Nothing had changed. Krupp had simply made a calculation. And the calculation was this. The personal costs of opposition were high and the personal benefits were low, while the personal costs of cooperation were low and the personal benefits were very high. Krupp was not evil in the way that Himmler or Heydrich were evil. He was not animated by a vision of racial purification or fantasy of continental conquest. He was something arguably more banal and more dangerous, a man who had decided that his business interests were the most important thing in the world, and that everything else, including eventually the lives of the human beings worked to death in his factories, could be subordinated to them. The historian Hannah Arendt, who covered the trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem in 1961, coined the phrase the banality of evil to describe the way ordinary bureaucratic logic could be deployed in the service of extraordinary atrocity. She was writing about Eichmann, but the concept applies with terrible precision to the boardrooms of German industry in the 1930s. Evil did not arrive wearing a mask. It arrived wearing a suit, carrying a briefcase, speaking in the language of quarterly projections and supply chain optimization. Tell me in the comments, do you think these businessmen fully understood what they were enabling? Or is that the most disturbing question of all, that it might not have mattered whether they understood? There is one figure in this story who understood better than almost anyone else what was happening, and whose arc is perhaps the most psychologically complex of all. His name was Hjalmar Schacht. Schacht was, by almost any measure, a financial genius. He had saved the Weimar Republic from hyperinflation in 1923 by designing and implementing a radical currency reform that stabilized the mark almost overnight. He was internationally respected, a man who moved comfortably among the financial elites of London, New York, and Geneva. He had no particular ideological sympathy with Nazism in its early, violent, street-fighting phase. But Schacht understood, earlier than almost anyone, that Hitler was going to come to power. And so he made himself useful. He used his international prestige and his network of contacts in the German business community to legitimize Hitler in circles where Hitler would otherwise have been dismissed as an extremist. He organized meetings, made introductions, and helped translate the raw political energy of National Socialism into something that serious men of money could take seriously. Once Hitler was in power, Schacht became president of the Reichsbank and later Minister of Economics. In these roles, he designed the financial architecture of German rearmament, a system of deficit financing so ingenious and so dangerous that would eventually contribute to financial pressures that made territorial expansion not merely desirable but, from a Nazi regime's perspective, economically necessary. Germany was spending more on armaments than it was producing in economic output. The only way to keep the machine running was to conquer, to seize the resources, the gold reserves, the factories, and the labor of neighboring countries. Schacht would later claim, at the Nuremberg trials, that he had opposed Hitler's policies, that he had tried to slow the rearmament program, that he had been a secret opponent of the regime all along. The tribunal ultimately acquitted him on all charges. Historians have been arguing about his culpability ever since. What is not in dispute is this: Hjalmar Schacht, in the early 1930s, made a series of deliberate choices to enable a regime whose violent, anti-Semitic character was already obvious to anyone paying attention. He did so because he believed, or chose to believe, that he could moderate it from within, that his expertise and his influence would allow him to be the voice of reason in the room, that he could be useful without being complicit. He was wrong. But the tragedy of Hjalmar Schacht is not that he was a monster. It is that he was a deeply intelligent man who told himself the most seductive lie available to intelligent people in impossible situations, that he was indispensable, and that his indispensability would give him power over events. It never did. Events had power over him. By the mid-1930s, the relationship between the Nazi state and German industry had entered a new and, for the industrialists, increasingly uncomfortable phase. Hitler had delivered on his core promises. The left had been crushed, the trade unions had been dissolved, communist and socialist parties had been banned, and the German economy was booming on the back of state-directed rearmament. But the regime was also demanding more. It was demanding that businesses Aryanize, that they expel Jewish partners, directors, and employees. It was demanding that they accept state supervision of their investment decisions and production targets. It was demanding loyalty, not just compliance. For many in the business community, This was the moment they began to experience something that historians have described as a kind of cognitive vertigo, the dawning recognition that the forces they had helped bring to power were not, and had never been, under their control. Reports from the era suggested that private conversations among German executives during the mid to late 1930s were full of complaints, anxieties, and expressions of helplessness. Men who had written large checks to the Nazi Party in 1932 and 1933 found themselves unable to make basic business decisions without party approval. Men who had welcomed the suppression of organized labor found themselves presiding over workplaces where political loyalty mattered as much as competence. Men who had celebrated the end of Weimar democracy found themselves operating in a system where the rule of law had been replaced by the arbitrary will of a man who was not, by temperament or education, equipped to run a modern industrial economy. But here is the crucial point, and it is a point that deserves to be said clearly. By the time German industrialists began to experience these anxieties, it was far too late. The regime was entrenched. The democratic institutions that might have provided some check on Nazi power had been dismantled. The political parties, the judiciary, the press, the churches, all had been subordinated or intimidated into silence. The army had taken a personal oath of loyalty not to the German state, but to Adolf Hitler as an individual. And industrialists themselves have been so deeply integrated into the economic infrastructure of the regime that disentangling themselves was no longer a real option. They were not trapped by Hitler. They were trapped by their own choices. The war years brought the final, most grotesque chapter of the relationship between German capital and National Socialism. As the Wehrmacht swept across Europe in the early years of the conflict, German corporations followed in its wake, acquiring factories in occupied territories, using forced labor from conquered populations, integrating themselves into an economy of plunder on a continental scale. The numbers involved are staggering. By 1944, there were approximately 8 million forced laborers working in the German war economy. People dragged from their homes in Poland, Ukraine, France, the Netherlands, and dozens of other countries to work in German factories and on German farms. They were not paid. They were not protected by any labor law. Many of them were worked to death, and they were working for companies whose names are still recognizable today. IG Farben, Krupp, Daimler-Benz, BMW, Volkswagen. All of these companies used forced labor during the war. The Volkswagen plant at Wolfsburg was constructed using forced labor from the very beginning. BMW produced aircraft engines using concentration camp prisoners. Daimler-Benz used forced laborers at multiple facilities throughout the war. The executives who authorized these arrangements were not, in most cases, acting under compulsion. They were acting on the same pragmatic logic that had guided their predecessors in 1933. Forced labor was cheaper than free labor. The regime was making available, and refusing to use it would put them at a competitive disadvantage relative to companies that did. This is the most important thing to understand about the relationship between Hitler and big business. It was not a conspiracy in the traditional sense, not a small group of men in a room plotting together with a shared vision and a shared plan. It was something more diffuse, and therefore more difficult to prosecute, more difficult to condemn in the clear, simple terms that justice requires. It was a convergence of interests, a mutual enabling, 1,000 separate decisions made by thousands of separate individuals, each one defensible in isolation and catastrophic in aggregate. Before we reach the end of this story, share this video with someone who thinks they already know the history of the Second World War, because the version most people know leaves out precisely the people who made it possible. After the war ended in 1945, the Allied powers faced a question of what to do with the industrialists and financiers who had enabled the Nazi regime. The Nuremberg trials, which most people know as the proceedings against Hitler's inner circle, Göring, Hess, Ribbentrop, and the others, were actually only the first of 12 separate tribunals. The subsequent Nuremberg trials included specific proceedings against German industrialists. The Krupp trial, the IG Farben trial, the Flick trial. Executives and directors from some of the most powerful corporations in Germany were prosecuted for crimes, including the use of slave labor, plunder of occupied territories, and, in the case of IG Farben, the production of Zyklon B, the gas used to murder approximately 1 million people at Auschwitz. The verdicts were, by any serious historical assessment, inadequate. Some defendants were acquitted entirely. Others received sentences of a few years and were released early in a wave of clemency that swept through Allied policy as the Cold War began and West Germany became a necessary partner against Soviet expansion. Alfred Krupp, who had been sentenced to 12 years, served 3. Upon his release, his entire fortune, would have been ordered confiscated as part of the sentence, was returned to him by the American High Commissioner for Germany, John J. McCloy. McCloy, it should be noted, had before the war been a lawyer with close ties to I.G. Farben. These connections were not a secret. They were a reflection of the way American corporate and financial interests had their own complicated relationship with German industry before 1933, a story that includes American investment in German rearmament, the board memberships of American executives in German companies, and the flow of technology and expertise across the Atlantic in the years when it was still possible to pretend that Hitler was just another nationalist politician with rough edges. Years later, witnesses and former officials who had worked in the denazification process would describe it as one of the most profound failures of post-war justice, a process that was thorough when it came to ideological criminals and almost deliberately blind when it came to economic ones. What does this story mean? What is the lesson, if lesson is even the right word for something this heavy? It is tempting to extract a simple moral, that corporations are immoral, that money corrupts, that the powerful will always protect each other. These things are true, but they are too comfortable. They allow the rest of us to position ourselves as spectators of catastrophe authored by others. The more honest lesson is about thresholds. Every one of the men described in this story made a first decision that seemed, in isolation, reasonable. Fritz Thyssen gave money to a movement that opposed communism. Gustav Krupp accepted government contracts that were commercially attractive. Hjalmar Schacht uses expertise to stabilize an economy that was genuinely in crisis. Each of these decisions led to the next one, and then the next, in a chain of choices that seemed, at each individual link, to be the pragmatic, realistic, sensible thing to do, right up until the point at which millions of human beings were being worked to death. There was no single moment when these men could look in the mirror and see themselves clearly. The self-deception was not a failure of intelligence. Many of them were brilliant. It was a failure of moral imagination, an inability or refusal to follow the chain of consequences to its end, to look past the quarterly reports and the rearmament contracts and the suppression of strikes and see the world they were building. This is not a story about monsters. Monsters are easy to refuse. This is a story about pragmatists, about men who told themselves they were being realistic, and whose realism helped build one of the most catastrophic regimes in human history. The meeting of February 20th, 1933, lasted a few hours. The consequences lasted decades. The scars are still visible, if you know where to look, in the clauses of post-war trade agreements, in the genealogy of European corporate law, in the careful, deliberate institutional design of post-war German democracy, which was constructed with the explicit goal of making that particular convergence of political extremism and corporate interest impossible to repeat. Whether it succeeded is a question every generation has to answer for itself. Adolf Hitler did not rise to power because of some dark magic. He rose to power because powerful men made calculations, signed checks, and told themselves that they were managing a situation rather than creating one. He rose to power because institutions that should have been resilient were brittle, because democratic norms that seemed permanent turned out to be surprisingly fragile, and because the people the most aloof from political extremism decided, in the critical years, that the left was a greater threat than the right, and acted accordingly. He died in a bunker in Berlin in April 1945, with the Soviet army less than a kilometer away, having lost a war he had promised would last 1,000 years. He left behind a continent in ruins, 60 million dead, and a legacy of industrial murder that still defines the outer boundary of what human beings are capable of doing to each other. The industrialists, for the most part, survived. Some went to prison for a few years. Some never faced any consequences at all. Their companies were rebuilt, restructured, rebranded, and returned to prosperity in the booming post-war economy. The men who had authorized the use of slave labor retired with their fortunes largely intact. Their children inherited wealth built, in part, on the bodies of people who were worked to death. And the companies themselves, some of them, exist to this day. You may own their products. You may drive their cars filled with their fuel or take their pharmaceuticals. They have issued apologies and established compensation funds and funded historical research, whether that constitutes justice, accountability, or simply the cost of doing business with the present, is something each of us has to decide. Power, in the end, protected those men for a long time, but it could not protect them from history. And history, if it is done honestly, if it names the names and follows the money and refuses the comfort of a narrative that reduces everything to one man's pathological evil, is the only tool we have left. If this story matters to you, and it should, subscribe to this channel, because this is a kind of history that most platforms would rather bury. Leave a comment below with your thoughts. Did the German industrialists bear as much moral responsibility as the Nazi leadership itself? It is a question historians have debated for 80 years. I want to know what you think, and share this video. Not because it is comfortable, because it is not. The most powerful men in Germany sat in a room in February 1933 and wrote the checks that ended German democracy. They told themselves it was a transaction, a temporary arrangement, a managed risk. They were wrong about all of it. And by the time they understood how wrong they had been, the world was already burning.